Mr. Chairman, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein, thank you for being here today. Obviously, you're here because Attorney General Sessions abruptly canceled his commitment to appear before this committee. It is Attorney General Sessions' job to be here today, and the fact that he has again chosen to skip this hearing is unacceptable. And the Attorney General, I believe, has chosen to skip this hearing today in order to avoid difficult questions about the scope of his recusal, questions which have already been asked of you by several senators, but I'll attempt to explore it a little bit more further. And I do think it's important that we have a full and engaged conversation with the Attorney General about the Department of Justice in front of both the Judiciary Committee and the Appropriations Subcommittee responsible for the entity he still leads. But let me start briefly with some good news, if I might. Mr. Rosenstein, you're here in part to talk about the budget of the Department of Justice. In 2014, Congress demonstrated its commitment to the Victims of Child Abuse Act by unanimously authorizing that in both chambers. And the Children's Advocacy Centers funded by this law conduct important forensic interviews that help serve law enforcement needs and meet the needs of child victims. And I'm pleased the President's FY18 budget request fully funds these programs. So I thought we'd start with at least one positive thing we could talk about.
Thank you.
As has been discussed by several others, it is the scope of recusal that is utterly unclear, both to lawyers and non-lawyers on this committee. You're here instead of the Attorney General, and you're here as acting Attorney General with regard to the special counsel, and you exercised the hire and would exercise the fire decision with regards to special counsel Bob Mueller. And that's because Attorney General Sessions is recused from that matter. On May 9th, you delivered a memo to Attorney General Sessions entitled Restoring Public Confidence in the FBI. And your memo exclusively focused on Director Comey's conduct during the Clinton email investigation and concluded, quote, the way the director handled the conclusion of that investigation was wrong, and you ultimately stated, having refused to admit his errors, the director cannot be expected to implement the necessary corrective actions. Is that roughly correct? Am I citing that memo?
I believe it is, yes.
And on that same day, Attorney General Sessions then sent a memo to President Trump relying exclusively on your memo where the Attorney General recommends Director Comey be removed. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
And during his January 10 confirmation hearing, AG Sessions stated he would recuse himself from any matters involving campaigns for President of the United States and specifically investigations into Secretary Clinton's email server. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, Senator.
So why did you write a memo to Attorney General Sessions exclusively discussing a matter that, as I understand it, Attorney General Sessions explicitly told us in Congress he was recused from? And why was that an appropriate basis for him to make a hire fire recommendation to the President on?
Well, Senator, I don't think that's a question for me to answer. I have said in my previous briefings of the Senate and the House that my memo truthfully reflects my views. I'm not in a position to comment on anybody else. So from my perspective, Senator, that memo is about what it's about. I do not know what was in anybody else's mind. I understand there are serious allegations that have been raised, and I think that it's up to Director Mueller to determine in the first instance whether any of these issues are within the scope of his investigation. That's why I haven't commented on it. I just appointed him several weeks ago. I haven't talked to him about the substance of the investigation since then. But I recognize the importance of these questions, and I think that Director Mueller ought to review that and make a determination of whether or not he believes it is within the scope of his investigation.
I appreciate that answer. It is distinct from an answer I got from you previously in another setting, so I want to make sure I understand you.
Well,
and I'll proceed carefully, and let's see if we can get to an answer that's appropriate in a public setting. Is it not your argument that the Attorney General made a recommendation to hire or fire the FBI director because that's outside his recusal, that the scope of his recusal doesn't affect his ability to manage the department?
I do have a personal opinion about that, Senator. I just don't think it's appropriate for me to be expressing my personal opinion about that. I hope I haven't said anything inconsistent with what I've said elsewhere, and please let me know if I have. But yeah, I do not want to comment on the recusal. I think the Attorney General made the decision to recuse. I wasn't there at the time, as you know, and there were processes. The decisions had already been made before I arrived about what matters would be appropriate for the Attorney General to handle. When I stepped in, I continued consistent with what had been done by these career professionals in the department, and I believe that I have faithfully, within the department, honored that recusal with regard to matters pending in the Department of Justice. But I just don't want to comment on what may have been in anybody else's mind or offer any opinion about that, because it's not for me to make those decisions.
Well, it is exactly, I think, why Senator Schatz asked a whole series of questions about the scope of recusal, because I am a lawyer. Senator Schatz may not be. He asked better questions than I did. But I also am having real difficulty understanding the scope of the recusal, its contours and definition, and I have an unresolved question about whether or not that's why the Attorney General failed to appear before us today, is to avoid having to answer direct questions about the scope of his recusal. I do appreciate and respect your appointment of a highly talented special counsel, and there have been questions from both sides that imply strong support for his independence and his conduct, and I appreciate the care with which you are answering my questions, but I'm simply going to conclude by saying I have unanswered questions that perhaps can only be answered by the Attorney General himself, and it is my hope that we will have him appear before both the Judiciary Committee and the Appropriations Committee charged with overseeing the funding for the department he is currently directing. Thank you.